When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite, looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Irvin Muchnick, independent author and journalist. Thank you to Crazy Train Radio for having me on. I enjoyed our conversation.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, this next guest has a new book out called Underwater, the greed-soaked tale of sexual abuse in USA swimming and around the globe. The information put together for this book has been backed by hundreds of interviews and thousands of pages of USA swimming files subpoenaed by the FBI, and it truly uncovers a generation of cover-ups of some of the sport's biggest names. Let's go ahead and welcome our next guest, Irvin Muchnick. So, Irv Muchnick, how are you, sir, and welcome.
Good, and always appreciate the opportunity to talk to readers about my difficult work.
Yes, it can be at times with all the nuances and trying to be as honest as possible.
Right.
Well, I'll start there before I get into this little ditty of Underwater. But I didn't realize at first that you were the nephew of Sam Muchnick, who was the former NWA president out of St. Louis.
Yes, that's how I started writing about pro wrestling, which was the subject of my first two books. I would say I grew up on the pro wrestling industry in an earlier era when I was knee high to a turnbuckle, and for a variety of reasons, some of which a grown man doesn't want to admit in public, I know far too much about that subject.
Me too. That's the sad part. But I know it'd be later on as things were changing. But when you were knee high to a turnbuckle, it wasn't eaten by George the Animal Steel, was it?
No, I think I was before George's time. I was more the Dick the Bruiser, Pat O'Connor, Fitz Von Erich. I was very gratified to see the modest success of the movie The Iron Claw, even though it didn't acknowledge what was my very first national long form magazine article on the dark side of that industry about the Von Erich family, which was published in Penthouse in 1988.
Yeah, we'll go back to that topic in a bit, but I want to start with the main event. Unlike most shows and things, but underwater. And with this, you were talking about the sexual abuse in USA Swimming and in other places around the globe. And most people, when I say that and bring that up, will think of, well, no kidding, because you recently heard about the gymnastics and things going on in court and stuff like that. I believe it was with the doctor, if I remember correctly. You know, a lot of the top name gymnastics were involved, unfortunately, with said topic. But when you break down the numbers, there would be, and I don't mean this in a good way, more opportunity because of the number of swimmers per capita compared to gymnastics. Am I far off with that?
No, that's one very key data point that informs my book, Jonathan. I mean, that is that this is not a competition for what's the worst scandal or the most heinous nest of predators of young athletes. But if you just do the numbers, there are 500,000 kids on my side of the border who participate in the after-school practices and year-round weekend meets that are kind of a staple of Americana. So that population dwarfs that of gymnastics. So inevitably, whether they're high profile or not, there's actually more abuse going on in the sport of swimming in terms of numerosity. Now, the other point there is that the story I'm trying to tell is not about celebrity cases of coach abuse, and it's not about the Me Too movement, and all of those things are valuable. And what happened to gymnasts under the thumb of Dr. Larry Nassar, who deservedly is going to spend the rest of his life in prison, was heinous. And I feel for those women. I applaud their bravery in coming out, and it did a lot to raise the consciousness of this issue. But the tale that I'm trying to tell is not about celebrities. It's not even about elite athletes who aspire to Olympic glory or college scholarships, but it's about the hundreds of thousands of rank and file young athletes, female and male, who are in it for other than commercial values. We're in it for life skills, competition, an extracurricular activity. And all of those things, in my country at least, subsidize the Olympic movement. So there was, coincident with the publication of my book, and it's doing about as well in Congress as my book is doing in the marketplace, unfortunately. But coincident with my book was the publication of a surprisingly strong congressional commission report, years in the making, that called for the two fundamental reforms that I think are so important in restructuring the American youth sports system, which has basically been untouched for almost 50 years, since the 1978 Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act, and we can get into that. But you're quite right. Swimming is bigger than gymnastics. There's more stuff going on, whether it's in the headlines or not, in swimming than in gymnastics. And the story of youth coach sports abuse is across all of the platforms of these Olympic sports, and is what I really hope readers who sink into this will deal with and change.
And I also want to point out, as far as the swimming side of this, which is what your book's about, is you were doing research and everything for this prior to the gymnastics case coming up front. But you actually, if I heard this right, because we know everything online is true, 100%, that you got interested in the topic from the educational standpoint, I should say here, with this, when your daughter was swimming, correct?
That's correct. And thankfully, she was not a victim, but there was a scenario on our local team that alerted me to a problem that wasn't being dealt with. And it so happened that at the same time, you're right, I've been on the case for 14 years now, since 2010. And what happened on my daughter Mara's team in Berkeley, California, coincided with the explosion of above ground of a story that had been underground for years. And that was thanks to an ABC 2020 report that embarrassed USA Swimming and its late chief executive, Chuck Wilgus, who made a total jackass out of himself on national television by being so defensive and defiant. And that's kind of the modern history of what is now being called the safe sport movement, which is a total joke, in my opinion, in its execution. And that's really what the book is all about.
Absolutely. Now, it's ironic, I guess the word is, I would think. And times have changed. I'm not sure how old you are, but I know like when I was going to school, and things kind of changed then, because then you start seeing school shootings and different things. And obviously that's a whole different topic and such. But what I'm going with is, I'm sure with my generation, yours, and previous generations, that our parents would have no fear in terms of being able to send us to school, to send us to swim practice or another sport if we partook in that. You know what I'm saying? There were certain
100%,
entities that
100%
our parents didn't worry.
And I think that there's actually an aspect of this that's a little bit underplayed in my book, but readers have pointed out to me, and that is I failed to really delve deeply enough into the era of the single sport obsession. When kids used to do different sports in different seasons, now there's pressure on them to focus on one sport, try to excel in it, try to go far with it in terms of getting a free ride in college and having a career in the sport. That's something new that I don't think was really part of our generation. The other thing that happened in the Congressional Commission report is very good on this, is that there was a subtle change in the late Cold War era. There was a fear in the U.S. that we were getting outgunned and out-propagandized by the Soviet bloc in the Olympics. And that created pressure to increase our gold medal haul. And that gave the U.S. Olympic Committee and its national sport governing bodies, all of which, in my view, are a bunch of phony 50c3 nonprofits that are really all about profits, to turn these local grassroots swimming team platforms into the developmental system of the elite Olympic athletes. And that has opened the door for carte blanche control by Svengali coaches who, a minority to be sure, but a significant minority and a damaging minority, turn into sexual abusers.
Yeah. And, that's one of the things that, and I don't have children of my own, but that would be one of the red flags for me. I would think I'd be able to send my kids to school, to a sports practice or whatever activity that's normal, that wouldn't I wouldn't have to worry about this. But sadly, it's something that I have to think about, and
Right.
most parents and stuff.
Well,
But
I'll go a step beyond
go
what
ahead.
you just said, and I'll say that America's sports parents are asleep at the switch. They've got their priorities wrong. They don't understand that the system we have is not the system that has always been there and the system that we can evolve and reform into. And by being asleep at the switch, they are enabling by their silence this program of control and ultimately abuse by coaches. It's a very sad thing, but parents have the power and they don't realize it. It's the dues of 400,000 families that are keeping USA Swimming afloat at the level of executive salaries and team development programs and high paid coaches at the top that we have right now. And that could change like that, but it requires people to read and process this Congressional Commission report and pressure their lawmakers to make the legislative changes that are necessary.
Well, during some of your answers so far, you brought up two key things that I think I should ask about, and maybe you can dive a little in depth with it. First is the money behind the sport, and there's money that comes, like you said, from the government and such. But also, what about is there a background check system for these coaches, whether they're volunteers or end up becoming paid professional coaches, whether at the college level or the Olympic level or, the advanced levels? So how much do we have there as far as a background, but also the money that filters into the system there?
Right. Well, background checks started in 2006. Look, they're better than nothing. They catch some people, but they haven't caught some really big fish. They haven't caught Andy King, who is a monster, who's a Mule Creek State Prison in California, finally caught in 2010 after, among other things, proposing marriage to one of his swimmers in San Ramon, California, Deborah Grodensky, who's a very a strong activist these days. The day she turned 16 years old, Andy King raped and impregnated a 13 or 14-year-old girl in Santa Clara County, California. So he's finally gone to jail, but he was, despite a background check system, his crimes and malfeasance across multiple West Coast U.S. states over a period of decades didn't even get caught. But here's the real thing, Jonathan, and this is why USA Swimming and the U.S. Olympic Committee should not be policing themselves. We shouldn't be arrogating these powers to what is in effect the internal affairs department of the police department. We need an independent government agency, as the Congressional Commission has proposed, that is independent of the funding and the influence of the Olympic movement. And if we would do that, it would make the United States closer to almost every peer country in having a national sports ministry, instead of having this hodgepodge of nonprofits anointed by the Olympic Committee running the whole show of youth sports. So there are problems, there are technical problems with the Safe Sport program, which was enacted in 2010 and began publishing finally a list of abusers so everybody could see them. So it's less likely that they can bounce from program to program, state to state, and even country to country. So that was an improvement, but it's still falling way short. The U.S. Center for Safe Sport, which started in the 2018-2019 period, right around the time the gymnastics scandals were breaking, is overwhelmed, underfunded, corrupt, incompetent, give it whatever name you want. It needs to go away, or it needs to go under the supervision of a government agency. And grassroots programs need to be taken out of the control of the Olympic movement and let them and the families who want to send their kids into this intense, driven atmosphere of competing from a very young age to become a professional star elite athlete. Let them do it on their own dime without the subsidies of hundreds of thousands of dues payers of USA Swimming.
Absolutely.
I keep coming back to that point, no matter what your question is, because the problems are structural and fixable, and they go beyond the rabbit hole and the he said, she said of every one of these individual cases, which I totally sympathize with the survivors. I think I can get burned like anybody else on an individual story of believing a survivor and misaccusing an innocent coach. But the point is, there's far too much of this in the water supply. We have the ability to get rid of it by changing the way we do youth sports in my country.
Absolutely. Underwater is published by ECW Press, so I will have a link to that as well. But there's a couple other things I want to bring up with you, and kind of first with the youth sports, which is quite interesting when you think about it. We have Without Helmets or Shoulder Pads, which was last year from ECW Press as well. And first with that book, what was that like, having Bob Costas give you a blurb on the topic?
Well, it was very exciting. Bob and I had been friends for years, and I finally got him to speak up for me and boost my book, which was tremendous. I mean, Bob, of course, is a very mainstream broadcast figure, but a uniquely principled and outspoken one, I must say. He's had a great career, and that was really appreciated. The football book is the flip side of the swimming book. Too many American girls are getting raped in sports programs which have expanded under Title IX and given them more opportunities. And too many American boys, 99% of whom had no aspiration of playing in the NCAA Division I level or in the National Football League, are systematically brained, suffer neurological damage, orthopedic damage. Let us count the ways. And what my book, Without Helmets or Shoulder Pads, documents is that even leaving aside the collision aspects of football, excuse me, my phone is ringing there, and that shouldn't be happening.
All good.
Even leaving aside the traumas of the sport of football on the field, few people realize that every year in the U.S., before anybody even puts on shoulder pads and helmets and collides with another athlete, one or two or three or four young people drop dead just from the over-the-top conditioning drills of their all-powerful coaches. They're dying of bronchial asthma. They're dying of exertional heat stroke, which is the number one killer. And most poignantly and perhaps ironically, with an African-American heavy population of football players, they're dying of a phenomenon few people know about called exertional sickling. 1 out of 12 African Americans carries the sickle cell trait, which is not the same as the well-known sickle cell anemia. They can lead normal lives, but they're in danger of an extreme event, rhabdomyolysis, breakdown of blood cells, breakdown of muscle cells in their blood from extreme exertion. And so we're at a point in the United States where we have a stem cell, or excuse me, a genetic cure for a sickle cell disease, which is expensive but is starting to save lives. At the same time that young African American men are dropping dead from sickle cell trait in football conditioning. So it's a crazy period in my country's history. I consider myself a sort of poor man's Edward Gibbon, who's illuminating the bread and circuses aspects of late empire. We enjoy our entertainments, but we don't really want to know about the human cost behind them.
With the football, and also this will cross over to the other thing I wanted to bring up where we started at the beginning, but obviously you've become somewhat of an expert with concussions. So how big is an issue do you see in youth sports, whether it be football or any other kind of contact sport, with the concussions?
Well, it's huge, Jonathan, and it's not really concussions per se. The NFL and the football industry have done a terrific job of tamping this down in public consciousness. It's not about discrete, diagnosable concussions, but it's about the accumulation of concussive and subconcussive contact over the course of a game, a season, a career. So there's a phenomenon called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is really a 100-year-old phenomenon in the medical literature. It was first applied to boxers in what was called punch-drunk syndrome. And a Nigerian-born doctor, Bennett Omalu, famously started applying it to dead Pittsburgh Steelers players in his autopsies about 15 years ago. And that's the modern a concussion crisis in football. But really what CTE is about is, and it's not diagnosable before death yet, although there's promise of finding some diagnostic tools coming down the pike. But the point is, it's not if you had a concussion or how many concussions you had, but how many blows you took, which caused the head to swivel and the brain to float inside the skull and pound against the walls of the skull. And these are things that aren't necessarily detectable, but there is a large portion of the American male population that played football in high school and peewee because of social pressure more than anything else, who are also susceptible throughout their adult life to these mental and neurological deficits, which I believe detailed studies eventually are going to show have an impact on American workplace productivity, on levels of alcohol and substance abuse, on domestic violence. So again, the price we pay for enjoying the Super Bowl or an NFL game on Sunday afternoon or a CFL game is not just that multi-million-dollar celebrity who's sprawled out on the field and is carted off, but is the many hundreds of thousands and millions of males in the feeder systems of this sport who are subtly and with nuance affected and damaged by this blood sport of football.
Well, as far as the research and stuff is concerned, concussions and other things that we're discovering, as you mentioned. One of the top names that I think of, to circle back to where we started, and that be wrestling, is he's done a fabulous job with the research and stuff, but the name Chris Nowinski, as far as doing research on the traumas and different things that you are discussing. But I realized Chris was starting to do the research after another topic, surprisingly, that you done a book on, and that being Chris and Nancy. And that's the story of what happened with Chris Benoit and his family over that weekend and such. And obviously, we are not going to 100% know. But obviously, there were autopsies and all that kind of thing, and research on his brain with Chris and the other organizations that, like you said, studied the Steelers and other people since. But with Chris and that whole situation with his family, like I said, it can't be 100% proven. But do you think, how much is that possibly with concussions or head trauma compared to the other thing people were bringing up, such as steroids and everything else on that end?
Right. The subtitle of my book is, I called it the pro wrestling's cocktail of death. So it had multiple factors. I would say originally I overemphasized the drug portion of it. And in fact, it's not really even about steroids. It's not roid rage, which is kind of a cheesy media term. The drugs in wrestling that are most damaging are the painkillers, the sleep aids, the things that performers get addicted to and cause depression and anxiety and wild behavior. But as I got more into the research, and certainly by the second edition of the book is now in its third, what we're calling ultimate historical edition. I moved more and more to the explanation of brain trauma for Chris Benoit's erratic behavior. And in fact, Chris Nowinski, the ex-WWE performer and ex-Harvard football player who started the Concussion Legacy Foundation, did get Chris Benoit's family, or his father, Mike, to donate his brain. And they said it was, I believe this may still be the case, the very worst images of postmortem brain damage that they'd ever come across from a chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So to answer your question, it was both. It was a cocktail of death, but brain trauma is a huge part of the high mortality and bad behavior rate of professional wrestlers in their 40s and 50s.
Like you said, then there was also the, like you were saying about, there's a certain period of time of the business, that being wrestling, that, like you said, there were so many issues, whether it be painkillers or uppers and downers, mixing in alcohol. And I know I can easily, and I'm not doing this to brag, I can call a guy like a Jake Roberts or folks like that who luckily are on the other side of that. And those guys are blunt, will say, hey, everything you just said, we take things to get up, things to go down, things to help our pain, because they were going 250, 300 nights a year and such. And it was certainly a different business even now, but it was a different business from what you grew up with, your uncle being involved with the NWA and such during the territory days. But do you actually still follow the business at all? Or?
Well, it's a constantly evolving business. So if you don't keep up with it on a day-to-day basis, you look up 2 years after you last saw something and you completely don't understand the storytelling and the moves they use now. So the short answer to your question is no, I don't. I have respect for the guys who put their bodies out to entertain us and appreciate some of the things they do. I'm totally befuddled by, the production style now. So I'm really not, I think I'm of a generation that wrestling has sailed past. But I mean, there's certain truisms about it and that is that that they have a wellness policy now, which like the USA Swimming